right, so bone microanatomy. We kind of have several chapters where you kind of go through the microanatomy of the system. What do the cells look like? How do they work? Things like that. With the bone, there is quite a lot of bit of anatomy that is kind of microanatomy, that you need to be able to see the microscopic structure in order to understand how the bigger parts work. So we have two types of bones, okay? Or two types of bone. There we go. That's what I meant. We've got spongy bone that actually does look like a sponge. It's got these air-filled spaces in it. And then we've got the compact bone that to the naked eye does look really solid. Now, the thing with bone is that it has to be stable enough to kind of bear our weight, but at the same time, we don't want it so heavy that it impedes our movement. So we have to kind of have two different types of bone that will kind of allow us to do both halves of that. So if I ask you, what type of bone is this? Where is it? Type. If I ask you, what type of bone is this? I'm asking, is it spongy bone or is it compact bone? So you need to understand that, okay? So that's one term that you need to make sure you understand for your practical. There are also different classifications of bone. We've got long bones. Long bones are going to be in your arms, in your forearms, in your legs. They are longer than they are wide. So if you look at the femur here in the picture, you can see that it is definitely a heck of a lot longer than it is, where? This way, wide. It's really weird when you're trying to work a mirror image of what you're doing. Okay, we also have short bones. Short bones are kind of like the cuboidal tissue. They tend to be about the same height as they are width, okay? So you've got the same height as width. Most of these bones are either going to be in the foot or in the wrist. The bones that are in your fingers are actually considered long bones because they are still longer than they are wide. With that in mind, you've got quite a few long bones. Another category that we have, or classification, is flat bones. Now I know you're going, okay, but that doesn't look completely flat. Flat doesn't necessarily mean flat like a piece of paper. It kind of means that it's very thin and it can have a curve to it. So your hip bones are actually going to be flat bones. Your sternum is going to be a flat bone. Most of the bones in your skull, are going to be flat bones. And the last classification that we have is irregular. This is actually a bone that sits kind of in the middle of your skull, and it is a very irregular shape. It's not long, it's not short, it's not flat, it's just an amalgam of those. Vertebrae are a really good example of that too, because they're not long, they're not flat, they're not short, but they are irregular. So when we say irregular bones, it means that it isn't any of the other categories. So if I ask you what classification this type of bone is, I'm looking for long, short, flat, or irregular. Those are going to be your four options. Now, looking at the spongy bone. Spongy bone has a lot of spaces in it, and the reason is because spongy bone actually gives us a little bit more, well, I guess I should say a little bit less weight to our bone, but still gives us the same strength as long bones have. So I think people think spongy and they think soft. This is not soft. If you tap on spongy bone, it sounds exactly like if you're tapping on compact bone. The only difference is you've got these spaces in between the hard parts of the bone. So you've got these pores in between the hard parts. Now you're probably going, okay, so why do we have this? Think about it. Your bone is really, really heavy. When it comes down to it, it's very dense. If all of my bones were completely solid, that would make me really, really heavy. If you've got somebody who has spongy bone in between the layers of their compact bone and somebody who just has completely solid bone, and we're both running away from predators, the heavier one's going to be slower. So even if through the process of evolution, there may have been some type of subhuman that actually did have solid bones, they probably died before they could reproduce because they were slower than the predators that would go after them. So having the spongy bone, even though it's hard like regular bone, like you would think of when you think of bone, makes us a little bit lighter. Now, something else, and this kind of goes back to how dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue looks. It looks very, very random, but it actually isn't. This looks really random, but if you actually blow up a piece of this, it is very organized. This looks like a bullseye, right? It's got these concentric circles. Think about buildings. Ancient Rome. What was one of the main things that they used in buildings to make sure that those buildings were sturdy? Columns, right? So having rings like this is basically making columns that can support weight. Now again, I know this seems random, but if you think about it, if I've got spongy bone, let's say in the top of my femur, of this top leg bone, the outside is going to be compact bone, but the inside is spongy bone. If I'm standing this way, if I'm standing with all my weight right here, there's going to be a bit of an issue with it being able to bear my weight. However, if in that spongy bone I have columns facing up and down, that actually still holds and bears my weight very, very well, because like I said, columns are really good at that. But if I do this, or lean forward, or lean back, I still have to have columns that'll be able to actually still hold or bear that weight. Having this random looking piece isn't as random as you think, because it's got columns in all of those directions that I can pivot without necessarily losing the stability that those columns give me, being able to bear my weight. So that's spongy bone. And when you see a spongy bone, it looks like this. It looks porous. Now, compact bone, that is the wrong computer. Let's talk about the long bones, because in the example, you were looking at a flat bone. And in a flat bone, you kind of have the two pieces of bread of a sandwich that are the compact bone, and then the spongy bone is the filling of the sandwich. Long bones are a bit different. In long bones, you still have spongy bone. Don't think that you don't. But you kind of have it at the end here. You've got this hollow space in the middle here, and then you've got it in the end here. And the entire outside of this bone is covered in compact bone. So, hollow bones. Again, doesn't sound like a really good idea, but it actually is. Because again, it makes us lighter, which means that if we're running away from a predator, we're lighter and able to do it. Going back to the idea of columns. If you take a bunch of straws from, let's say, Whataburger, and you stack them up like this and you whack your hand into them, the straws are going to be fine. Even though they're just straws, that column structure will actually really do well when you bang on them, and actually you probably hurt your hand. But when you come at it from the side, that's going to be a different story, because when you come at it from the side, there's a real good chance that they're just going to bend. We like having hollow bones because it makes us lighter. We don't like having hollow bones because if you come at it from the side, there's a real good chance that you're going to break them. So what do? We fill this space up with something lighter. So yellow marrow, yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is actually fat, and fat is actually less dense than bone. Think about it. You're boiling meat, you're doing something like that. What's the first thing that floats to the top? The fat. And it's because it is less dense. Now, is it as hard as bone? No, but it does fill that space so they're not as easily broken. So let's talk about the parts and pieces of a long bone. We know directional terms. We just finished learning directional terms. So we have the head of the femur up here. This is the part that is attached to your hip. The bottom down here is the part that is at your knee, okay? So this area here is the proximal epiphyseus, okay? Proximal means closer to the torso. So this being proximal totally makes sense. Now, if you come down here, this is the distal epiphyseus. Okay, so again, if you think about the directional terms, this is going to be further away from your torso. So this is the distal epiphyseus. This right here, that shaft portion, that is called the diaphysis. Okay? So when it comes to how our bones are put together, they articulate to each other. They meet up and then they move. If you've got a joint, you've got this joining of the two bones. We say that they articulate. At the ends of our bones, you have pieces of cartilage called articular cartilage because it's where they articulate. The thing about bone to keep in mind is bone is about the consistency of fine grit sandpaper. Fine grit sandpaper would not feel good rubbing against fine grit sandpaper. So what do? We cover or cap the ends of our bones with cartilage. Cartilage is a little bit rubbery and it's a lot smoother so that when you're moving, you're rubbing cartilage on cartilage instead of bone on bone. Yes, there is still fluid in there and there's still other things, but it's not as abrasive as bone on bone would be. Internally, in the epiphyseus of our bones, we do have spongy bone. But like I said, as you get to the shaft portion, it's going to be hollow. This is called the medullary cavity. What did medulla mean? Medulla meant middle, right? What does cavity mean? Cavity means hole. So medullary cavity, literally translated, is middle hole. And if you look right down the center of that shaft, there is a hole in the middle. As I said, in that hole, we've got the yellow bone marrow. Now, bone has to have something covering it. You can't just leave it the way that it is and expect it to do well. So inside, there is a lining, and outside, there is another lining. Peri means around. Osteo means bone. So around the outside of the bone, you have the periosteum. The periosteum is actually a good place for ligaments to bind to and tendons to bind to. Internally, where we actually have the spongy bone, you have the endosteum, endo, inside, and osteo, bone. So there's a lining inside, there's a lining outside. Okay, wrong computer. All right, taking a closer look at the bone. Remember I said compact bone looks compact. I didn't say that it was compact. I said it looks compact or it looks solid. It really isn't. When you look at it microscopically, you see spaces. So here's that periosteum that I was just talking about that lines the outside of the bone. Here's the compact bone. Do you see these little units here? Look at the shape. They're columns. They are still columns, holding weight and really good at bearing weight. but you still have spaces in here too, okay? These little units that look like bullseyes are called osteons, okay? And each one of the rings in the osteon, each one of the lifesavers in the osteon is called a concentric lamella, like a concentric circle, like a bullseye, going around the entire circumference of your bone, going around the entire way around your bone are the circumferential lamella. So not only do I have these little columns, along the outer rim of my entire bone, I have these columns as well. And then to fill these spaces, because think about it, if I've got cans and I'm stacking them up on each other, do those cans actually fill all the spaces? No, they're always going to be little spaces that have openings to them that are going to be hollow because the can doesn't fit there. Unless you've got square cans, which we don't, we've got those concentric lamella, they're always going to be those spaces that would be left empty. We can't leave those spaces empty. We have to fill them. So we fill them with bone tissue, except it's not in the shape of a circle anymore. So if you look here, see those little spaces that are just fill up that space? They're not circles. They're not going all the way around the outside of the bone. These are called interstitial lamella. Interstitial, in between the tissue. So they're filling up those spaces that those concentric lamella can't perfectly fill. Internally, there's my spongy bone. Looks like a sponge, right? And here, being pulled away from that internal bone is the endosteum. Okay, endo, inside, osteo, bone. In the center of these osteons, now remember, this is a bone, so these are going to be going completely up and down the length of our bone. We have the central canals, okay? So you've got compact bone, you've got spongy bone, you've got the endosteum, you've got the periosteum, you've got the osteons as a unit, and each one of these rings is a concentric lamella. You've got the rings going along the outside of the bone, the entire circumference of the bone itself. These are the circumferential lamella. And then you've got those that are filling the spaces, the interstitial. You've got the central canals. Now, that medullary cavity that we were talking about, that's right here. Okay? Now, something else. My living cells in my bone, the ones that are still reproducing and stuff like that, they are usually right under the endosteum or right under the periosteum on the outside of the bone. If that were to rub, it would kill those cells. So we can't have that. They have to be anchored in some way, shape, or form. So if you look at this figure, do you see these little things right here? They actually anchor that periosteum in place. These are called sharpies fibers. Sharpies fibers make sure that that periosteum can't rub up and down. Instead, it's anchored in place. This also helps to kind of keep it stable enough so that if my ligaments are basically pulling on it, it's not going to slip and slide some way, shape, or form that could kill those cells. So again, we've got spongy bone, we've got compact bone, we've got the osteons, we've got the concentric lamella, we've got the interstitial lamella, here are the circumferential lamella, here are my central canals where my blood vessels can go. See these going sideways? These are called perforating canals. If you've ever heard of a perforated eardrum where they puncture through the eardrum, these are the blood vessels that go sideways. Something you have to understand with bone. When bone is growing, you can't put cells down after the fact. The cells kind of get put in place, and then the bone is grown around those cells. So being able to get living tissue, your bone, nutrients and stuff like that, you can't just count on it soaking through. There have to be blood vessels embedded within the bone to actually share and do that kind of thing. So we've got these perforating canals, and we've got the central canals that are housing the main blood vessels that will allow these cells to kind of share. And I'll show you how in just a minute.